Have you ever looked at a raw photo and wondered, where do I even start? Today you're in for a treat. You're about to embark on a transformative journey through the realms of raw photo processing using Lightroom Classic. Whether you're a beginner or a seasoned pro, this guide will shed some light on each step, ensuring that your image not only stand out, but tell a story that captivates. Let's dive in. First things first, lens correction. It's just not a step, but it's a foundation for your photo's integrity. Lens correction is automatic upon import, and I find it's rare that Lightroom miss on this. So if we enable profile corrections here, you can see that it identifies Canon as well as Canon EF 85mm f1.4 LIS. And that was the lens I used when I shot this model for a sports company here in Sweden. And also it has the correct profile currently with this version of Lightroom and my firmware. Also remove chromatic aberration. It's important to ensure that we don't get that ugly sort of color shifts on the edges. And by doing this, to ensure that we have automatic lens correction upon import, we ensure that we have consistency and accuracy right from the start throughout your entire photo shoot and all your photos. So lens corrections, really important to have a good foundation before we start our edit. With our lens perfectly corrected, let's reshape our story by stepping into the world of transformation. An image perspective can make or break its impact, and that's where transformation comes in. Transform will correct vertical and horizontal lines, fixing any skew or tilt. And it's also very essential when you do architectural or landscape photography. Lightroom has really good automatic feature for this, as it has with most of its features. But sometimes we need to choose between precise manual adjustments or Lightroom's auto transform features, because auto will sometimes hit and miss. So each image will require a unique approach to perspective corrections. Let me show you. If we take this photo of the model for a Swedish sports company, if I press auto, you can see it makes a tiny shift in perspective. And I think that it looks better in auto, so I would leave this photo this way. But if I open this photo from Barcelona, I did a street photo session in Barcelona a couple of months ago. If I press auto, you can hardly see the change. And we can say, okay, this is a good photo, but I feel that it doesn't really look perfect. So I can go manually into a guided mode on this one. And on guided, we can have up to 4 perspective lines. So let's say I know that this corner is straight. So I draw a guide on this corner. I know that the horizontal on this street is level. And I also know that where I was standing, this is a straight line. So if I draw these 3 guided transform lines for Lightroom, we can see if I go off, auto, or guided. And this is a judgment call. You need to sort of use your eyes as well as your knowledge about perspectives and just make an educated guess. I would go with guided on this photo, but let me show you another extreme example. If we take in this photo, I press auto. Look what Lightroom do. This is, well, a little bit strange, but it's a very busy photo and there is no lines. So as just with any AI, it needs to give you an answer. So when it doesn't have a good answer, it will give you a bad answer. So here I would just leave this photo off. So just like that, we know that transform is always a manual judgment call between going auto or leaving it off or doing precise manual adjustments. Once transformed, let's reshape the canvas. Yes, it's time to talk about cropping. Cropping isn't just cutting, it's composition. It's where we as an editor or photographer decide what stays and what goes. Cropping enhances your composition and it will help you focusing on the right subject as well as removing distraction. And we can choose from various aspect ratios or freeform crop for creative flexibility. When doing cropping in Lightroom Classic, there are 3 shortcuts we need to know. The first one is R, it will activate the actual cropping overlay. You can also press the tool for cropping over here. Then we can choose from various aspect ratios, or we can just do a free-form crop by dragging the crop tool. If we want to unlock to keep the original proportions, you can just untick this lock here, and then you're free to do a free-form cropping. I will go with a 4x5. I want to crop 4. Social. The second shortcut you need to know is X. X will flip your preset proportions of your cropping, so 4x5 or 5x4. And the last shortcut we need to know for cropping is O. It will cycle through the various cropping overlays we can use to help us decide on how to best crop an image. I'm going to stay by rule of third, which is a very classical overlay for cropping. Not want this image really this tight, because I want to keep all this amazing smoke, but she's the centerpiece, so I want her sort of focused more in the image, so center, and this I will go. If you are curious of all the overlays, you can go to Tools, Crop Guide Overlays, choose Overlays to Cycle. Here you have all the available ones, and if you untick any of them, then they will not be part of the cycle. So for example, if you just want to have rule of thirds and the golden spiral, for example, but I'm going to leave all of mine ticked. When you're ready to crop, just press enter and you have cropped your image. With our composition in place, it's time to bring colors into life with white balance and color correction. I believe that colors narrate emotions, so correct color and white balance ensure that your photos feels authentic. By adjusting the temperature and the tint, it will convey the right atmosphere for an image, but it's also important to ensure that it doesn't look wrong. I usually go here to set test auto just to see what Lightroom thinks I should do, and you can see that it is an almost unnoticeable. It just adds a little bit on tint because temperature was spot on when I took this photo. More important is to pick the right profile. So I'm going to go to camera faithful to ensure that I have the correct colors for my Canon camera. Then just to check, I will go to slide the temperature just a tiny to see how the mood of this photo will change. Because remember, temperature is about getting the right white balance and temperature, but it's also about setting a mood. We have some creative freedom, especially for photos like this one. But I feel by double clicking temperature, I'm going to reset it, and I actually like it more as it is. Next, we have the color mixer, or the HSL sliders. And you can use the sliders to be creative with the colors, but at this point, at step 4, it's more about color correction. Do we have any colors in the image that doesn't look good? And we can do this by sliding in the sliders for hue, saturation, or luminance. I'm going to double click to reset. Or you see this tool here is a point drag and drop. So for example, if I click on this, and I go over to the image and I click on his hat, then it will, by dragging now up and down, I will adjust the colors in that area. And this is actually where I feel that we need to do a little bit of adjustment, because the purple smoke makes their sort of student hats, in Sweden they are white, a little bit too purple. So I'm actually going to drag down magenta a little bit, and then I know, so I will drag down purple a little. And this purple is going to go look really good with some creative teal as well. Not the teal and orange, but teal and purple. So I'm going to use the hue for blue and slide it very aggressively. And you can see that it will affect the sky only. I'm looking over the entire image while dragging this, and no, it's not affecting skin tones or anything like that. So I'm going to leave this very subtle, around maybe -13. Just add a little bit of sky color back. And I think this will actually just be enough. I'm going to go into hue, click on her skin tone and see, yes, it's obviously going to be orange. If I drag this up, it's going to be green. Drag it down, it's going to be too pink or too red. But we can add a little bit more tan to her skin by sort of deducting just a little bit of red and orange. I think that looks too much. I'm gonna re-drag the slider. And by pressing here or holding, you can see before and after, and this is super subtle. And that's how color correction should be. We are not adding our creative touch here. We are just correcting the image to look natural and good. And that's white balance, it's tint, and it's color mixer, HSL sliders to correct the image. With our colors now speaking volume, it is time to clean up the photo to ensure that nothing distracts from your story. Every masterpiece needs a touch-up, so it's time to clean up any unwanted elements. We have 3 tools at our disposal for cleaning up our images. We have the spot removal tool, the healing tool, and the cloning tool, and they serve similar but a little bit different purposes. And this is not a retouch tutorial, because it's a 13-step raw photo processing tutorial, so I'm not going to go over in detail how to retouch, but I'm just going to show a little bit on sort of part of the purpose. So here I have an area where I feel the name is a little bit distracting, as well as you can even add that it's from an integrity standpoint, we shouldn't leave that name there. So I'm going to use the spot removal tool, and by having a mouse with a scroll wheel, I can very quickly adjust the size of my brush, or I can just go to the size slider and drag here. And the AI of any spot removal tool in Lightroom is really good, but one rule of thumb is try not to do too large of area at the same time. So by sort of adding in an area, I also add to the area from where Lightroom can actually fetch to clean up next part. So I'm actually going to drag in a little bit of an arch like this, because that gives me more area to work with while working down into the image like this. And you can't add on top of what you have already done, so it gets a little bit crowded fairly quickly, and that's also why I try to drag in an arch like this to give me more to sort of fetch from. And I think this is starting to look fairly good. I'm just gonna find a last area to sort of try to fetch from. Here you have. And then I'm going to switch tool to the spot removal, or the healing brush, sorry. Then I'm going to switch to the healing brush, and I'm going to add a little bit on top of this area, and we get a much softer transition from there. And I think that actually cleans up this spot really good. So if we zoom out again, we see that this is not adding any distraction to the main subject of this photo, which is her. I also have a little bit of an area down here that I feel is distracting. I think it's jewelry instead of something sort of an error of this image. And here I'm gonna try the clone removal tool. And this works a little bit different, because here we actually need to define where to fetch from. So I'm gonna click my option key, click here, and then I'm gonna click here. And then I tell Lightroom to fetch from and to. And then I'm gonna manually shift this area a little, and it's not perfect, but I have a much better, cleaner edge. And then I'm gonna go back to the healing brush, make it a little bit bigger than my cloning brush, but I can't add on top. So I actually by purpose gonna click next to it and then drag it on top of that darker edge. And then I think that looks really good. So just by doing that, we have sort of removed the name, which is distracting, and we have removed this shine on the jewelry, and we are ready. We have cleaned this image up, and we're ready to move on to the next step. With a pristine image, we are now focusing on illuminating our subject, and it's time to turn our attention to exposure adjustments. Exposure is the heartbeat of any good photo. It's about striking that perfect balance between light and shadow. Exposure sets the overall brightness or darkness to create the desired mood, and it's a delicate balance that defines the atmosphere of your image. And if you're new to raw exposure processing, don't worry, you can just press auto. And I admit I often press auto if I don't have a clear agenda with my photo, because it gives a good overview what you should change. Also, don't be afraid if you feel that these values are very high, like in the 56 to even 70 range is very common when dealing with raw photos. But as I've done this a couple of times, I'm actually gonna undo this and do this manually. So I'm gonna do a little bit of exposure, but not as much as sort of auto suggests. I'm also gonna dial down on highlights because I want more. So if you see I drag this to the bottom or to the, it's only gonna affect the sky. So I'm actually gonna make the sky a little bit darker to give more contrast between the dark and the smoke of the sky. Usually when dealing with raw images, we always need to bring up shadows. So if I drag this all the way, you can see that we are starting to get shadows around her back. And if we drag it all the way down, we have no shadows, but somewhere around 25 to 30 range I think is going to be suitable for this image. But then I'm actually going to do something opposite to what auto said. I'm going to increase the whites. If I drag this all the way up, you're going to see we get a lot of details in her hair, but as well as sort of around her to sort of give her a little bit of pop. But we can't do it like this because it's just too much. But if I leave this around, let's say 30 range as well, and then I'm gonna drag down blacks around -10 just to give a little bit more sort of strength to the shadows. And I think this is a really good starting point for this image. But then I'm gonna add selective exposure, and we do that with masks. So I'm gonna do Shift M for a radial mask. I'm gonna leave that more or less around her hair, back of her head, as well as part of her back. And I'm gonna make this softer. And then I'm gonna redo this. So I'm gonna increase on the whites, and what you're gonna see, what's gonna happen is her hair is starting to pop. And I'm gonna increase a little bit on highlights, tiny on exposure. Selective exposure usually end up like this. It looks really horrible. But if we do it very subtle, as well as more work on highlights and shadows, we can give the desired effects. And I'm gonna check if I need to increase shadows, but no, that is gonna look washed out. But I need a little bit more pop. So I'm gonna add a little bit of contrast, and I'm gonna drag down on blacks on her as well. And I think this is an excellent exposure setting, selective exposure for this type of photo. So we have salvaged the details in the bright sky as well as in the shadows on her back, and we have also ensured that this critical step in exposure, that we have exposed the elements that we want more emphasis on in this photo. And I think that's how we should look on exposure. What details do you want to highlight and what details do you want to remove? And this gives a pretty nice image, to be honest. With our exposure finely tuned, it's time to add depth and dimension through contrast. I think contrast is the secret to making a good photo pop, to give it that extra crisp. It's where we decide the balance between light and shadows in the details of your photo. Some people like to add contrast with the contrast slider, but I don't think that's give us enough control. So I like to use tone curve. Tone curve will give us precise control over shadows, midtones, and highlights, and it also shapes the overall tonality and depth of the image. If you haven't used the tone curve, or if you don't know what this means, basically you could say furthest down to the left you have dark, and the more you go into the histogram, so it's the same as this one, the histogram. So black and white, or dark and light. So if I were to take this point in my tone curve and drive this to the right, I'm telling everything left of this going to be black. In an extreme case, this is extreme contrast. Also, when working with any type of tone curve and contrast adjustments, always protect your mid-tones, because that's usually where you find skin tones. When I work with the tone curve, I usually start by adding a midpoint to protect my midpoints. Then we can add a point here and a point here. Now we have a 3-point or a 5-point, depending if you start counting the start and end point. And if I take this point and drive it downwards, we are darkening the dark part of the image. And if I increase this point by dragging it upwards, I am adding light to the lighter part of the image. And now you have what you probably have heard before, your typical S-curve. But for this image, I would want to do something extra. I'm going to take the starting point and I'm going to move it upwards. And you can read output to 10. So basically what I've done is I told that the blackest part of the image is no longer black. It's not black, it's 10. So it's, let's say it's 5% grayscale. So it's a little bit gray in the dark area. So it becomes a little bit matte in its feeling. And I think it's very suitable for this image. So tone curve for precise adjustment of your highlights, shadows, and midtones. Having sculpted your image depth, it's time to infuse it with some vibrance and some life. Saturation and vitality brings your photos from good to great. It's where we bring colors to life. But it's also easy to overdo it, so balance is the key word here. Vibrance and saturations are an often misunderstood slider in Lightroom, at least according to me. It's really important to understand when to use each. Saturation is for overall intensity, but vibrance is for muted colors. And vibrance also has some smartness built into it because it protects skin tones. That's why I think it's important to increase vibrance before we do saturation. And I can show you quickly by, if I go saturated all the way to the right, it looks horrible, right? And if I go vibrance all the way, it looks horrible, but in a different way. You can always see that it's gonna increase mostly on all the color parts, but she looks untouched. And that's because vibrance protects skin tones. So by double clicking, I reset it. So I'm gonna increase vibrance, maybe 25 on this image. And I usually end up between 20 and 30 if I'm gonna add some real punch to an image. Then I'm gonna decide, do I need overall saturation or do I want to decrease overall saturation? And for this image, I'm gonna go on an opposite vibrance saturation look. So a little bit more vibrance and I'm gonna decrease a little bit saturation overall. Then we can go into selective saturation and we can either use the HSL sliders in the color mixer, because here we have saturation. So I could, for example, say I want more purple or magenta. And I'm actually going to do this. I'm going to increase purple and magenta a tiny bit. So it adds back a little bit punch to the smoke, but leave all the other colors more muted due to decreasing saturation. But vibrance also going to push them a little bit. And then I'm going to use the mask we did for the selective exposure. And I'm going to use that for selective saturation as well. So I'm actually going to add a little bit saturation to her, because it's in the mask, right? And then I'm going to do a duplicate and invert mask. So select everything around her. And here I'm actually going to do the opposite. So I'm going to decrease saturation on everything except her. And that's going to also do the selective. But now we have a balance because they are still sort of pushing a little bit because we increased them before we decreased the overall saturation. And this is starting to look really good. With our colors now singing in the photo, it is time to put your signature touch on it or your client's touch on it. It is time for color grading. Color grading isn't just for video, it's equally important for photography. Color grading is where you can put your unique visual signature on a photo, or a client's unique signature as well. You can do color grading or split toning a few different ways. You can use the HSL sliders, we can even do it with tone curves, but today we're going to do it with color grading wheels. And I'm going to be here on this to show all three, midtones, shadows, and highlights. And I usually want to start with midtones actually. I'm just going to take my mouse, drag it all the way to the end, and then I'm going to do a fast circle to see is there any specific color that I like more for this photo? And due to all the purple smoke, I'm actually want to infuse a little bit of purple into the image. Then I'm going to do shadow, and I'm going to go with a typical teal into the shadow. So I think that's going to look good because we have so much shadow in the bottom part of this image. And then for highlights, I'm going to go somewhere in between. And color grading is, I would say, 50% artistic feel or creativity and 50% color science. That's why teal and orange is so commonly used. Overused, if you ask me, but it's because you have teal on this side of the color wheel and you have orange on the other side. They are opposites, and opposites in the color science usually looks good. But you can also be on the same side, colors that complement each other, and that's what we have done today. But then I'm gonna open up the shadow part. So I don't worry too much about the balance of each saturation for each wheel at this point. I just want to find like a good starting point when I do color grading. Then I go into shadows, and I can start to tweak sort of the perfect hue. And then I can take the slider for saturation, and I have much more granular control, because you don't want to add too much. It's going to look a little bit like a comic book. But in shadows, I usually feel, especially if you do teal, we can be pretty aggressive. Then I go into midtones, and here's the opposite. We need to be super subtle, because as soon as we start to add too much saturation of our color into the midtones, the photo's just gonna break. So I think as subtle as 6. So I add 6 on saturation of my color, and I'm gonna shift it a little bit more into purple rather than pink. And then finally, highlights. It is, I think we need a little bit more blue, and then on saturation, if you see, we are influencing mostly the sky, and we need to be subtle here as well, so I'm gonna leave it on 50. And now if I hold my mouse key on the color grading, you can see before and after. And all that teal into the shadow and that subtle touch of purple and blue into this image makes it super cinematic, as well as we are helping with the focus of this photo, the center, which is the girl in the middle of the image. So I think this is a perfect example of where color grading adds depth and touch to a photo. Having set our scene, it's time to focus on bringing clarity to our photos with sharpening. Sharpness brings clarity to our story, ensuring every detail is crisp and clear. Sharpening is about enhancing fine details without creating noise, and it's crucial for texture-rich subjects like her hair and her back hair. It is also important to use masking to avoid over-sharpening and to apply sharpening selectively to avoid artifacts. So I'm gonna close down on tone curve and color grading, and we're gonna open details. Option or Alt key, depending on if you're on a Mac or PC, is your best friend when it comes to sharpening. So by holding Option key, I can get this sort of black and white to show where sharpening would happen, how much and what details I'm masking. Just the same way, instead of just dragging on details and have no clue what's happening, if I'm holding Option or Alt key, I get this sort of masking overlay, what's happening and what areas will be affected on details, and the same for radius. So by increasing radius, the sizes of the pixels, I get a better understanding of what's happening when I do my sharpening. And then I can either keep Option key clicked to get the black and white representation of only the sharpened areas. It's easier to see sharpening in black and white, I think. And then I just release Option key to see where sharpening happens. So before, after, and it happening in her hair as well as on the edge of her body. Downside of this is that we have also sharpened his hat and some part of his hand, but then we can do some selective by using masks. So by selective, I'm gonna select the mask we used earlier to desaturate part of the background, and then I'm just gonna go down all the way down here and take the sharpness and drag down if I do it all the way, you can see that it starts to become a little bit too blurry. So, and if I wanted that effect, I would have gone from f2.0 to 1.4 when I took the photo, but I still want a little bit de-sharpening just to sort of decrease on the edge of him. And by doing that, I'm also going to adjust the mask, the size of the mask a little bit, to ensure that we are sort of hitting the details of his cap here, because this edge is going to be affected. And I'm also going to take textures and go down to about -15. And if we look at before and after, it's actually it's subtle, but it's subtle we want. We don't want that sort of photo where someone is just sort of over sharpening and over coloring. Subtle is your friend, also when it comes to sharpening. With a sharp and clear image, it is time to add those personal final touches. Touch-ups are the artist's final strokes. It's where you put those final touch-ups to ensure you have a crisp and clear photo, and all the details you still want in the image are left there. And for this photo, I've had a specific thing in mind from start, and that's the sunlight. And I'm actually going to open the color grading wheel. And remember, we put most of the colors here, right? From teal down to pink and purple. But the opposite color to that is yellow, the sunlight. So watch this. So first I'm going to do a K for a brush mask. And then I'm going to gently paint some strings of various sizes on the highlights of her hair, not the entire hair. We have one here and then a little bit like that. And then I'm going to go to increasing highlights of her hair. And then we're going to increase the whites, because too much is going to look very, very strange. But it's just about adding a little bit of touch to this. And then I'm going to increase temperature on this just a bit. 6. Enter. So the sunlight is hitting her hair. After that, Shift M for a radial mask. I'm going to put that over her entire hair like this. And I'm just going to increase temperature. So I'm sort of adding artificial sunlight, warmth to this. And I'm actually going to do this mask less soft. Because you might want, why don't you use the AI mask to sort of, it needs to look natural. So if the sunlight was actually hitting her in a pocket of all this smoke, it would have some spill on sort of the surroundings. So we can't do it too clinical, too surgical. It needs to have some sort of spill to look natural. So already we are starting to see some. I can hide this. See, before and after. And this is sort of the secret sauce, what's gonna add to this. Then I'm gonna do another radial mask. I'm gonna put that over her entire. And then we're gonna go into a subtraction mask, and I'm gonna do a subtraction on a radial gradient. And I'm gonna remove most of her hair, because we don't want to dual hit this. And then I'm gonna go back to this mask here, the base mask, and I'm actually gonna make it a little bit smaller. And then I want even more highlight increase. I want to ensure that we increase visibility on her back. So increase shadows, increase highlights. I'm going to increase the whites just to give a little bit of a sort of a glow effect. And then I'm going to add a tiny, not too much, because this isn't natural and it's her back against the sun, but it's still enough to give some warmth. So there you have it. So the contrast yellow to all this sort of purple and teal just makes her pop. It's what we buy the composition all the way from cropping. So this is why we sort of follow the 13 steps of raw processing. It's because we are sort of layering, we are building a story from start. But we are not done, because we have one thing that's distracting me and has been distracting me from start, the flag. So I'm going to press K again for brush. I'm going to zoom in. Then I have a fairly soft brush, but I need the edge, and then I'm gonna paint on the edge of the flag like this, and we're gonna follow, and I'm gonna speed this up. There we have it. The touch-up is ready, and we have sort of emphasized details, and we have decreased part of the image that we don't want to sort of the eye to get stuck on, because we just want total focus on the moment happening in this sort of graduation time. She is in her pocket of sunlight, her pocket. Time is frozen, and I think we have a really good photo here. Long journey so far, and we are closing into the end. But I wanted to show also something about parallel workflow, bringing Lightroom photos into Photoshop for that extra control on some details. Sometimes Lightroom needs a helping hand with Photoshop, so this is how they work in tandem. Right-click, edit, edit in Photoshop. We can also open as a smart object, but for this I'm just gonna edit in Photoshop. Wait for it to load, and I'm not gonna do something super fancy, just because I mean it's not entirely an edit video, but I would want to go over like smart sharpen, for example, and let's see what that does. So if I go over amount, I can control my shadows and highlights individually. And this is a typical area where in Lightroom we can just add sharpening, and we can adjust maybe in how large of areas, but we don't have this granular control. So if I look at preview before and after, because for example, if I'm adding more amount to highlights, for example, I can control that. Do I want more or less sharpening, for example, in the hair? And this is where I think that extra final touch on this photo is gonna make the difference, but we can't overdo it. Back to it needs to be subtle, needs to look fairly natural, but I think sharpening in the hair is what's gonna add some details to this. We could also do something simple just for the sake of it. So let's add some curves. In the curves, I'm gonna lighten up the entire image. Then I'm gonna click on the actual mask and invert it. Then I'm gonna hold Command and Option and click on the layer just to ensure that it just hits this layer. I'm gonna make sure my mask is selected. I'm gonna go to my brush, put it to a really low opacity, maybe 3, 4, 5%. And now we can actually brush the effect of this curve layer into the image. So let's say, for example, let's make a really big brush. We want to add even more sort of highlight effects to her hair. And maybe it doesn't look like much is happening, but back to its Photoshop. So we have such an amazing control. So just by hiding, it's almost not noticeable, but it is there, and we can increase the effect either by painting over the same area several times, because if we have an opacity of 5%, each time I use the brush, it's 5%. So it's 5% on top of that's 5%, and 5% on that's 5%. Or we could, of course, just increase opacity, but I think it's better to go multiple passes on details we want to emphasize. And just by brushing in this. Now if I'm gonna hide, you can see that it's not much, but this small things is the reason why you sometimes look at a photo and says, wow, is an amazing photographer. And very often, if you're sort of used to this, I can tell that, yeah, that's a great photographer, but it's even a better editor. Because this extra time spent on details, that workflow, is the entire difference between a good photo or a great photo. So let's check the curves on this. Yes, I think that's what's the last thing that was needed. I'm gonna flatten my image, and if I close this image and press save, we're back in Lightroom and all the changes we did in Photoshop are applied. So that's how you can work in a parallel workflow. Just edit in Photoshop, make your changes, save, and we're back in Lightroom with that changes made. And this is also why it needs to come last in the workflow, because once it comes back from Photoshop, we have lost some of the connections to our raw image, so it's much harder to make changes on top of the Photoshop workflow, so we make that last. Final step, step 13. Now when we have perfected our photo, it is time for that crucial final step, extra important when exporting for social. And the final step, exporting, is where we go from studio to stage. Exporting is fairly simple. I'm just gonna go over this very quickly. I would say export is mostly depending on the usage of your file. So choose folder for later. I think that's the best one, because then you can just select where to send your files. If you want to rename them, very good if we are doing batch exporting, but also image format. This is where, depending on sort of where you want to send it. JPEG if you want to use it online. TIFF, for example, if we need to do prints, but then we would probably also enlarge this photo. Resizing could be good if we are doing social. So for example, I have a preset here that says web. Then it's JPEG, 90% quality, because we want a tiny bit compression. I want to resize it to the longest edge, 2000 pixels. Because the one that happens first is one that's going to be affected. I say that I don't want to enlarge, so if this image were to be smaller, then it can't scale it up, then it just extract it, and we need a resolution of 72 pixels per inch if it's for social. Output sharpening, sharpen for screen amount standard. That's my standard setting for export. I never changed this, because except if I were to print. But most of my sort of Lightroom exports go either to client, and then I export them in the highest resolution possible, or it goes to social, and then I use this preset, 2000 by 2000, 72 pixels per inch, 90% on quality, sharpen for screen amount standard, because we have so much sharpening already that we don't want to introduce artifacts for over sharpening. Then I just hit export, and there we have it. A complete journey, 13 steps through raw processing using Lightroom and Photoshop. But I'm not done. I have some final thoughts I want to share with you to ensure that you can take this journey on your own. We have navigated 13 essential steps transforming a raw file into a masterpiece. Each step, from the initial lens correction to the final exporting step, all plays a pivotal role in transforming and creating a visually stunning and emotionally resonant image. And remember, the power of the photo processing lies in its ability to bring your unique vision to life, creating a stunning photo. Keep experimenting, keep refining, and most important, keep sharing your vision and your story through your photos. Each frame you capture is a story yet to be told. And if today's journey has sparked new ideas, hit that like button to let me know. And if you have any questions, or if you want to share your own experiences, I'm eager to hear about them in the comments below. I also hope you would want to join our community of vibrant storytellers by subscribing and turn on notifications, so the next creative adventure is just a click away. And if I sparked your creativity, if I enriched your creative toolkit, please share this video with a fellow creator who might find it equally valuable.